I just want to take you to that. Australia, the United States. The United States has higher inflation than Australia, almost double the headline rate right now. What's your own feeling? Is Australia truly different?
Well, look, I don't think it is. I mean, certainly you're right. The headline rate in Australia, 3.5%, is so much less than the 7% that we're seeing here, and even the 5.5% that you're seeing in Europe, in the UK, for instance. But there's a very good chance, I think, that it will catch up. I mean, if you look throughout history, the last 30 or 40 years, you're seeing increasing integration of financial markets around the world, and there's always been a very high correlation between inflation rates in the US, Europe and Australia, and also interest rates as well. So, look, it's not a perfect correlation, but it would be very surprising indeed if you saw huge inflation in Europe and very low inflation in Australia. That would be very strange. So, look, I do expect that if rates go up, and it's still a big if, there's a forecast, of course, of 4 or 5 interest rate increases just this year in the US, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on central banks around the world and other rich countries to put their rates up too. Otherwise, you'll see falls in the Australian dollar. I notice it's already gone under 70 cents. That's certainly something I feel here in Washington. And that's likely to fall further if there's a big differential open up between the two interest rates.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about exactly that. Like if the Reserve Bank here, say, for example, does not move on interest rates this year, and that seems to be a preferred choice to sit and wait from the Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe. But at the same time, in the meantime, if the United States were to raise rates by, say, 4 times, and given it is the global leader, the global influence, just how would Australians feel it? I mean, the pressure would surely start to mount on the Australian Central Bank and indeed on banks because they do refinance into global markets.
Yeah, look, that's right. The first point I'd make there is that the governor did originally say that rates wouldn't change until 2024, and now I notice he's saying 2023. Well, look, I think 3 to 6 months of high inflation, he'd be changing his remarks again. So I wouldn't be reading too much into this new 2023 outlook. I think it's going to be all extremely dependent on the inflation data that comes in, and the RBA has a 2 to 3% band. If inflation is much higher than that for a sustained period, then they're clearly not doing their job. So they have to lift rates significantly. So it's very, very data dependent, I think. But look, if for some reason rates do stay low, then yes, you'll see a weaker Australian dollar, I think, in the short to medium term.
Okay, and the second part about this is that inflation is always a consequence of generally a growing economy and, companies being forced to raise prices and wages and then pass that on to consumers. But it's not necessarily until the end of the cycle of raising interest rates, it's not necessarily a sign of ill health in an economy, is it?
No, look, and I think it's worth pointing out too, the Australian economy has done very well in terms of the jobless rate. It's quite extraordinary how it's bounced back so quickly. I've been shocked by that. I think many economists have been shocked by that. If you compare the pandemic situation in the US, you still have missing basically 1.5 million to 3 million jobs, whereas that's not the case in Australia. So we've bounced back very well. The problem is, of course, that we have a huge increase in debt in Australia, both household and, of course, public debt as well. And that's the big concern going forward. I mean, there's 3 countries in the world massively lifted their debt during the pandemic. That was Australia, the US, and also Japan. And it's just extraordinary, the level of increase, about 20 percentage points. That's kind of a wartime increase, if you like. And when interest rates do eventually go up, or if they do go up, at some point, servicing all that debt is going to become very, very costly. And I mean, it's not so much a problem for this generation, but in the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's going to be a real problem.
So it's interesting also to note the Reserve Bank, because interest rates got down so close to zero, went like other central banks around the world and used quantitative easing. In other words, they bought back bonds. So they're sitting on a whole bunch of bonds. They're not likely to actually sell them. They're likely to hang on to them until they all expire. But it just goes to show $640 billion worth of government bonds they're sitting on, as well as the federal government continuing to issue bonds to fund its own debts.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's certainly a debt addiction by governments around the world. It's just extraordinary. I mean, we saw those figures this week of the US government debt surpassing $30 trillion, and $7 trillion of that was just in the last 2 years, which really is just so striking. I mean, the other striking fact, though, is borrowing costs have not really surged yet, and that's not just the case in the US. It's also the case in Australia. it seems like Western governments can borrow huge sums and still pay relatively low amounts of money for the debt. It just remains to be seen how long that process can go on for. I mean, you'd think from first principles it has to stop at some point, but we haven't reached that point yet.
It's going to be fascinating just to watch this play out, and no doubt we'll be speaking about this a number of times this year. Adam Creighton from Washington, as always, great to have a chat to you.
Indeed, Russ.